So I've hit the headlines a few times in the last couple of weeks with some comments that I've made about how I think Jersey's housing market is broken. Really, I was just echoing what I said in the 2018 election campaign, which is that ultimately we have a housing market that works in the interests of investors and not in the interests of people who need a home. In yesterday's Jersey Evening Post, an open letter to me as Housing Minister was published from the Jersey Landlords Association, who've challenged me to justify these comments that I've made. And I'm happy to have this opportunity to respond to that, although I'm a little bit surprised that it's even needed, because I think for most islanders out there, it will be axiomatically true that there are some real problems in our housing system here. Whether you're the victim of one of these deficiencies or whether you know people who are, I think we all know that there are countless young people out there who are worried about the prospects of being able to buy a home in the island that they're from. We know that there are people languishing on waiting lists for accommodation that's suitable for their needs. And we know that there are people in the private sector living in homes which are poorly maintained and don't meet basic minimum standards, but have no choice and can't go anywhere else. So the JLA's asked me 3 questions. They've asked, was Jersey's housing market ever not broken? They've asked, how is it broken in my view? And most importantly, they're asking me, what am I going to do about it? So, was the market ever not broken? Well, to be honest, probably not, but there were some things that were better in the past. There did used to be more support for first-time buyers. The social rental calculation system, I think, was fairer back then than the 90% of market rate system which exists today. But there are also some things that were worse back then in terms of the quality of accommodation, and successive governments failed to make the changes that would be necessary to deal with those issues, and there was years of a lack of investment that we're still picking up the pieces from today. So how is the market broken? Well, if you don't want to just go by the anecdotal examples that we're all aware of, or just look at a housing list for rental accommodation and look at the extortionate rates that are being charged, let's just look at the facts and the statistics. So in 2015, the Statistics Unit published the Housing Affordability in Jersey report, which showed us that almost 3/4 of lower income households living in the qualified private rental accommodation sector could be considered as living in rental stress, i.e. spending more than 1/3 of their income on housing costs. It was 53% in the unqualified sector and 45% in the social sector. So another report came out in the same year called the Household Income Distribution Survey, which laid bare the really unacceptable levels of relative poverty in Jersey. They told us that 1/3 of pensioners in Jersey live in relative poverty. 56% of single-parent households live in relative poverty. And the breakdown here shows that the cost of housing is the #1 contributing factor for causing relative poverty, and it's been getting worse. In the 5 years leading up to this report, they told us that the proportion of qualified rent households living in relative low income trebled from 1 in 10 to 3 in 10. And these figures are all out of date now. These are 5 years old, and we know that things will have got worse since then because of the continued freeze in wages that there has been both in the private sector and in the public sector, and the fact that housing costs are still going up, up and up. So I think by no stretch of the English language can that be described in any other term other than broken. It is clearly broken and clearly getting worse. So I'm also asked, what are we going to do about it? And that's the most important question. And so I think that we have a real opportunity now. Jersey has just faced a few months of a real health crisis leading up to now an economic crisis. For housing, during that time we pressed the pause button. We froze rents and we've made it illegal to evict people for being unable to pay their rent because of hardship they've faced through the coronavirus crisis. There'll be many people out there who've lost their jobs, many people who saw their incomes go down in this time, people who may well have taken up debt to be able to make ends meet. And so we've got to use this moment to make some of those structural changes to improve the housing market and improve that situation for people out there, whether they want to own their own home or whether they want to rent a home instead. So I think there's a few things we need to do. But first of all, I think we need to extend that rent freeze for a bit longer to give us the time we need to address these changes, rather than lifting the rent freeze and allowing people in October to have their rent go up when economically they may well not have recovered because of this crisis. So we need some time. And with that time, I think there are some really important things that we can do. We can look at introducing rent regulation like exists and is successful in many places across Europe on rent stabilisation that prevent people from facing unacceptable and unjustifiable rent increases, and provide extra security for people in their homes, knowing that they can live there without being kicked out and have some predictability on what rents they're going to be able to pay. And that means setting up a rent tribunal so that when unfair rent increases are proposed, those tenants have an ability to challenge it. So I think we need to do that. We also need to address the 90% market rate rule in social housing rents, which many people think acts as a benchmark for the private sector, which is completely inappropriate and is still having an effect on levels of people living in relative poverty, which is also unacceptable. We need to get the government to get off its hands and release some of the sites that we own that are being allowed to fall into disrepair or not being used, that ought to be places where we can build first-time buyers' homes for those young families to buy and exist in perpetuity for first-time buyers, so there's a long-lasting legacy of help and support for those who want to get on the housing ladder. And the government needs to take action on this, and frankly, it's not happening quick enough. So we need to push for those. The other thing we need to do is to introduce a compulsory landlord register that enables us as a government to know how landlords are behaving, what the standard of homes they're providing is, know that they're protecting deposits, know that they're paying tax on the rental income they're making, and most importantly, be able to refuse somebody permission to rent out a property if they're not prepared to meet those basic minimum standards. We tried to introduce that system a few months ago, but it was subjected to a wrecking motion by politicians in the states of Jersey who kicked it into the long grass. In that debate, 18 politicians out of 49 declared that they're landlords. Just 2 declared that they're tenants, and I'm one of them. If the landlords had not been able to take part in that debate because of their interests, the result would have been the opposite, and we may well have been able to go ahead in introducing that landlord register to help improve standards in the rental market. So we need to cast aside these vested interests, put the interests of the people who politicians are meant to represent first. And there's a lot more that we need to do beyond just fixing housing. We need to take action to provide better healthcare support for islanders. We need to make sure that young people have the opportunities to gain the skills they're going to need for the economy into the future. We're facing an economic crisis now, and there will need to be an economic package put together by government to support the island through this crisis. But our focus can't just be on restoring GDP figures. It needs to be about more than that. It needs to be about realigning our society so the economy and government services work in the interests of ordinary people. What we need is a new deal for Jersey. My colleagues and I in Reform Jersey are working hard to bring these proposals to the table and encourage people to support them and get behind them to address some of these unfairnesses and the inequalities we face in our society. Housing is very high up on that list. We have that opportunity. I hope we'll seize it. And if you want to be a part of that change, I hope you'll consider joining Reform Jersey.